War has always been cinema's most dangerous mirror. But what happens when that reflection becomes too raw, too honest, too horrifying for governments to allow its light to spread? These are the films that censors tried to bury the stories that question patriotism, sanity, and truth itself. From banned premieres to reels burned in vaults, these are the 15 war movies the world was never supposed to see. Number 15. The Battle of Algiers, 1966. When the Battle of Algiers exploded onto screens, it was not just a movie, it was an uprising on celluloid. Directed by Gillo Pontecorvo, it told the story of Algerian resistance fighters battling French colonial rule with the kind of brutal realism that felt more like documentary than drama. Shot on the actual streets of Algiers and using non-professional actors, it pulsed with authenticity that no Hollywood set could replicate. But its power was also its curse. France banned the film for 5 years, claiming it endangered national morale. The United States military quietly used it as training material in counterinsurgency operations, while politicians called it dangerous propaganda. Italy nearly withdrew it from festivals due to diplomatic pressure. Behind the scenes, Pontecorvo received threats and screenings were attacked by extremists. Critics, however, hailed it as genius, calling it a masterpiece of political filmmaking. Yet for decades it was suppressed, shunned by nations who feared its mirror of imperial violence. Today, the Battle of Algiers stands as a haunting testament to truth in wartime cinema, its grainy black and white images echoing louder than any speech. It asks a question that no censor could silence: how far will the powerful go to erase the face of rebellion? Number 14. Paths of Glory, 1957. Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory is often praised as one of the most searing anti-war films ever made, yet for years it was unseen in the very countries it condemned. The story follows French soldiers forced into suicidal attacks during World War I and later executed as scapegoats by their own generals. It was a damning portrait of corruption, cowardice, and moral decay at the top ranks. When it premiered, the French government panicked. They called it an insult to national honor and banned it outright from French theaters for nearly 2 decades. Switzerland and Belgium followed suit, fearing unrest among veterans. Even the U.S. Army tried to discourage its screening on military bases, labeling it subversive. Kubrick faced enormous pushback from studios who feared political retaliation. Kirk Douglas, who both starred and produced, had to fight relentlessly just to get the film finished. Despite its critical acclaim, many European theaters refused to project it until the 1970s. But over time, Paths of Glory became recognized as the film that tore the mask off wartime heroism, exposing the bureaucracy of death. Its silence was once enforced by censors, now it speaks, louder than ever, whispering that the true enemy of honor is the system that pretends to defend it. Number 13. Apocalypse Now, 1979. Apocalypse Now was supposed to be a war epic, but it turned into a descent into madness, both on-screen and off. Francis Ford Coppola's vision of Vietnam as a nightmare drenched in chaos nearly broke everyone involved. The production collapsed under typhoons, nervous breakdowns, and a ballooning budget that terrified United Artists. The story of Captain Willard's journey to assassinate Colonel Kurtz mirrored the insanity behind the camera. When early cuts surfaced, government agencies in several countries denounced it as anti-military propaganda. The Philippines temporarily halted filming, fearing its depiction of corruption during martial law. In the U.S., censors debated its violence and psychological themes, while veterans groups demanded boycotts. Coppola's battles extended beyond politics. Marlon Brando's erratic behavior forced rewrites. Martin Sheen's on-set heart attack almost ended the film. Rumors spread that the director was losing his mind. The final cut premiered at Cannes, unfinished, and yet it received a standing ovation. Despite calls to censor or ban it, Apocalypse Now emerged as a hypnotic masterpiece, its insanity reflecting the truth of modern war. It reminded the world that censorship cannot tame chaos, and that sometimes the greatest battlefield lies within the human soul. Number 12. The Deer Hunter, 1978. When The Deer Hunter hit theaters, it divided a nation still bleeding from Vietnam. Directed by Michael Cimino, this epic explored the lives of working-class friends whose American dream is shattered by war. Its Russian roulette scenes became cultural nightmares reflecting both the physical and psychological scars of returning soldiers. But with its brilliance came fury. The film was banned in several socialist countries, including Vietnam and the Soviet Union, which accused it of spreading lies about the North Vietnamese. Protesters disrupted screenings across Europe, and even in America, some veteran groups called it slanderous and politically manipulative. The scene depicting prisoners forced to play deadly games was so shocking that censors in Sweden and New Zealand demanded cuts. Behind the camera, the production was equally intense. Cimino's obsession with realism pushed the cast to emotional exhaustion. Robert De Niro and Christopher Walken delivered haunting performances under extreme pressure. Critics were polarized. Some hailed it as genius, others called it propaganda disguised as tragedy. For a time, its legacy was buried under controversy, but over the decades, The Deer Hunter resurfaced as one of cinema's most powerful reflections on trauma and patriotism. It forced audiences to ask an unthinkable question: was the real horror of war on the battlefield, or in what it did to the survivors who came home? Number 11. Full Metal Jacket, 1987. Stanley Kubrick returned to the battlefield with a vengeance in Full Metal Jacket, a film that tore away the last illusions of heroism. Told in two halves, the first follows Marine recruits crushed by brutal training. The second follows them through the nightmare of Vietnam's destruction. From its release, the movie became an immediate target for censors. Military advisors refused to cooperate with Kubrick, claiming it would destroy morale. In several Asian countries, including Singapore and Malaysia, it was temporarily banned for its relentless profanity and violence. Television networks refused to air it uncut for decades, calling it psychologically damaging. The chaos extended behind the lens. Kubrick's perfectionism drove the cast to breaking points. R. Lee Ermey's tirades were so authentic, they became the standard for drill instructors everywhere, yet censors tried to mute his dialogue in international releases. Critics accused Kubrick of dehumanizing his characters, but that was his point, to show how war reshapes men into machines. Even after all the outrage, Full Metal Jacket became a cornerstone of modern war cinema. It exposed not only the violence of conflict, but the violence of indoctrination. Kubrick's message still lingers that the battlefield begins in the mind long before the first bullet flies. Number 10. The Thin Red Line, 1998. Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line was less a war film and more a philosophical vision of mankind trapped in endless violence. When it premiered, it stunned audiences expecting another Saving Private Ryan-style spectacle. Instead, Malick offered poetry silence and moral dread. Yet that same beauty made censors uneasy. Some nations in Asia banned the film's release over its portrayal of soldiers questioning faith and authority. Religious boards accused it of blasphemy for suggesting nature was indifferent to human suffering. The film's meditative tone and depiction of psychological collapse were seen as subversive during a time when patriotic war dramas dominated. Behind the scenes, Malick's return to filmmaking after 20 years sparked chaos. Dozens of A-list actors, including George Clooney and Adrian Brody, had their roles drastically cut. Studios panicked over the film's unconventional pacing and demanded edits. Malick refused, choosing instead to release a nearly 3-hour reflection on the futility of violence. Though it was quietly buried in its theatrical run, The Thin Red Line found its audience later. It became a cult masterpiece studied in film schools and revered by directors. It showed that the most dangerous war films are not the ones with explosions, but the ones that dare to look inside the human soul and find nothing but silence. Number 9. Coming Home, 1978. Coming Home was not just a film, it was a wound reopened. Directed by Hal Ashby and starring Jane Fonda and Jon Voight, it told the story of soldiers returning from Vietnam, broken in body and spirit. Released during the final years of the war's shadow, it challenged everything America wanted to forget about its own guilt and grief. Censors across the globe reacted with alarm. In several European countries, including Italy and Spain, certain sequences were cut for being too politically charged. American military officials condemned it, labeling it anti-patriotic, and warning theaters against showing it near military bases. Government networks refused to air it for years, claiming it could harm morale among veterans. Behind the scenes, the controversy nearly derailed production. Jane Fonda's outspoken activism against the war made her a target of right-wing groups. Bomb threats plagued screenings. Studio executives considered shelving it entirely, fearing national outrage. Yet, despite all that, Coming Home became an instant classic. It won 3 Academy Awards and gave voice to an entire generation of forgotten veterans. Its real offense to censors was compassion. It showed that courage was not found in victory, but in vulnerability. The film remains a haunting reminder that sometimes truth returns home long after the war is lost. Number 8. Johnny Got His Gun, 1971. Dalton Trumbo's Johnny Got His Gun was the movie so disturbing that even its own director kept it hidden for years. Based on his own novel, the story follows a soldier who loses his limbs, face and voice after an explosion, yet remains fully conscious, trapped inside his own body. It was a scream of anti-war despair, like no film before or since. Censors around the world recoiled. The film was banned in the United Kingdom and restricted in several European nations. American networks refused to show it, and critics called it unfit for public viewing. The Motion Picture Association tried to block its release for extreme imagery, even though much of the horror was psychological, not visual. Behind the camera, Trumbo poured his blacklisted anger into every frame. It was his revenge against decades of political persecution. The low-budget production struggled to find distributors. Even when it finally reached audiences, the reaction was shock and silence. Many theaters pulled it after 1 week. Years later, heavy metal band Metallica resurrected its legacy using scenes from the film in their music video, for one introducing it to a new generation. What censors tried to erase became immortal through art. Johnny Got His Gun remains a nightmare carved into conscience, proof that the most terrifying wounds of war are the ones no one can see. Number 7. Platoon, 1986. Oliver Stone's Platoon was not fiction, it was confession. Based on his own combat experience in Vietnam, it stripped away every myth of glory and replaced it with the smell of fear, blood, and betrayal. When it premiered, it electrified audiences, yet terrified governments who feared it would reignite public anger over the war. The Philippine government, which hosted production, tried to halt filming midway due to concerns over its political message. In some Middle Eastern countries, the film was briefly banned for its religious overtones. South Korea delayed release for a year, citing anti-Allied sentiment. Stone faced backlash from military circles accusing him of treason. Protesters called him unpatriotic, while soldiers who had served saw painful truth in every frame. The graphic realism led to cuts on television versions worldwide. The Academy, however, could not look away, awarding it Best Picture and giving voice to the soldiers who had long been silenced. Behind the scenes, Stone's relentless pursuit of authenticity pushed his actors to live in real jungle camps, enduring exhaustion, hunger, and emotional trauma. The result was a film that captured not victory, but disintegration. Platoon shattered censorship, not through defiance, but through honesty. It asked the question no general ever wants to hear: what happens when the enemy looks exactly like you? Number 6. The Killing Fields, 1984. The Killing Fields was a movie born from horror and haunted by truth. Directed by Roland Joffé, it chronicled the friendship between New York Times journalist Sidney Schanberg and Cambodian reporter Dith Pran during the Khmer Rouge genocide. When it premiered, audiences were not prepared for its unflinching depiction of mass murder and survival under tyranny. Governments were even less ready. Thailand banned the film, fearing political backlash from neighboring Cambodia. Vietnam censored it for portraying communist brutality. In the United States, conservative groups accused it of stirring anti-American sentiment, while in the United Kingdom, several scenes were heavily edited for broadcast. The images of skull fields and starving prisoners were deemed too real, too painful. Behind-the-scenes filming was nearly as dangerous as the story itself. Shot in Thailand near active conflict zones, the crew faced threats of arrest and sabotage. Actor Hang Esngor himself, a survivor of the genocide, relived his trauma while performing. His performance would win him an Oscar, but the emotional cost was immense. Critics hailed The Killing Fields as a masterpiece, yet many theaters avoided showing it, fearing protests. For years, it was banned in Southeast Asia. Only later did it resurface as a historical monument to truth, It remains proof that some stories are so powerful that even governments cannot bury them forever. Number 5. Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, 1964, Stanley Kubrick's dark satire. Dr. Strangelove turned nuclear war into a grotesque comedy, and that alone made governments panic. Released at the height of the Cold War, it mocked both American and Soviet leadership, portraying them as reckless fools capable of ending the world by accident. Censors in several nations tried to shut it down before it reached the public. The British Royal Air Force demanded edits fearing it revealed too much about nuclear command protocols. Spain banned it outright for mocking authority. In America, Pentagon officials condemned it as dangerous propaganda that could weaken public trust in the military. Even television networks avoided it for decades, labeling it politically radioactive. Behind the scenes, Kubrick faced surveillance and paranoia. Rumors spread that intelligence agencies were monitoring production for national security breaches. Peter Sellers played multiple roles blurring satire and insanity, while Kubrick fought to keep his vision intact against studio fears of lawsuits from governments. When it finally premiered, it horrified officials and delighted critics. Its black humor revealed what censors feared most, the absurdity of absolute power. Today, Dr. Strangelove is studied as both comedy and prophecy, a warning wrapped in laughter that censorship could never silence. Number 4. Casualties of War, 1989. Brian De Palma's Casualties of War was inspired by real events that military courts had tried to bury. The film followed a squad of American soldiers in Vietnam, confronting moral collapse and guilt as their humanity disintegrates under pressure. From its earliest screenings, the film was condemned. The Pentagon refused to cooperate, calling the story damaging to the national image. Several countries in Asia banned it outright. Television channels worldwide refused to air it for over a decade, citing psychological trauma and offensive subject matter. Behind the scenes, the tension was unbearable. Michael J. Fox took the role to escape his comedic image, but found himself emotionally shattered by the story. Sean Penn's intense performance created real on-set conflicts mirroring the chaos of the plot. Critics were divided, some calling it exploitative, others a masterpiece of conscience. De Palma fought censorship boards scene by scene, insisting that the film was not about hatred, but about the loss of moral direction in war. He won the right to release it uncut, but box office reception was cold. Only later did critics reappraise it as one of the most fearless anti-war statements of the 20th century. Casualties of War endures as a scar on cinema, a reminder that censorship often hides the crimes that art dares to confess. Number 3. Fires on the Plain, 1959. Kon Ichikawa's Fires on the Plain was one of the earliest war films to be banned in Japan for showing too much truth. Set in the last days of World War II, it follows a starving soldier wandering through the Philippine jungle as his comrades descend into madness and desperation. It stripped away every trace of honor and left only horror. Japanese censors were outraged. The government had tried to rebuild a national image of dignity after defeat, but Ichikawa's film shattered that illusion. It depicted soldiers resorting to unspeakable acts of survival. Critics accused it of dishonoring the dead. Several theaters refused to screen it, and the studio was pressured to withdraw it from international festivals. Behind the scenes, Ichikawa faced intense opposition from producers who feared backlash. He insisted that war was not about heroes, but about hunger, disease, and insanity. The bleak tone and absence of music were deliberate, meant to crush any trace of glamour. For decades, Fires on the Plain remained a forbidden masterpiece, quietly passed between cinephiles and banned in television syndication. When it resurfaced in the 1970s, it was hailed as one of the greatest anti-war films ever made. It taught the world that truth itself can be a crime when nations try to forget their past. Number 2. The Bridge on the River Kwai, 1957. David Lean's The Bridge on the River Kwai appeared at first to be a grand adventure about honor under captivity. Audiences were mesmerized by its spectacle, but behind that beauty lay a storm of censorship battles and government anger. Based loosely on the construction of the Burma Railway, the film portrayed British prisoners forced by Japanese captors to build a bridge for their enemies. Both nations despised it. The British government protested its depiction of collaboration, while Japan condemned it for humiliation. In Singapore and Malaysia, it was banned for years and heavily censored elsewhere for its brutal depiction of imperial cruelty. Lean fought constant pressure to soften the story. Studio executives feared international boycotts. Alec Guinness nearly quit over script changes demanded by officials. Yet, Lean refused to compromise, insisting that war corrodes every moral code, including loyalty. When it premiered, the controversy only amplified its fame. It swept the Academy Awards and became a timeless classic. But what made it dangerous was not the violence it showed, but the quiet question it asked beneath the explosions: how much of one's soul must be surrendered before obedience becomes betrayal? Number 1. All Quiet on the Western Front, 1930. No war film has faced such relentless censorship as Louis Milestone's All Quiet on the Western Front. Adapted from Eric Maria Remarque's novel, it was among the first movies to show the psychological destruction of young soldiers during World War I. It offered no heroes, only victims lost in mud and terror. Germany's newly rising Nazi movement saw it as treason. At its Berlin premiere in 1930, protesters stormed the theater releasing stink bombs and shouting propaganda. The government banned it within days, calling it anti-patriotic and anti-military. Austria-Hungary and Italy followed suit. In the United States, several states demanded cuts, claiming it was too depressing for public morale. Behind the scenes, Milestone and Universal Pictures faced threats from foreign diplomats and nationalist groups. Some versions were destroyed. For decades, the film disappeared from circulation in Europe. When it resurfaced after World War II, it was hailed as prophetic, a warning ignored by history. Its legacy remains immortal. Every generation that rediscovers All Quiet on the Western Front sees not a movie, but a mirror. It shows that war destroys not only armies, but truth itself, and that censorship is often the last weapon of those who cannot face what they have done. 15 films that governments tried to silence, yet each one spoke louder through history. They dared to question victory, to reveal guilt, to show that truth bleeds brighter than propaganda. Which of these banned war stories struck you the hardest? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more forgotten films that defied the world's most powerful censors.